Hello everyone, I am Demented Kirby, and welcome to my channel, the Commander Tavern. The Commander Tavern is a channel dedicated to my favorite Magic the Gathering format. The Brewery is a series on this channel showcasing my spicy brews and other deck techs. On this episode of the Brewery, I will be discussing a commander I've been playing for a long time, Edric, Spymaster of Trest. I've been playing this deck since I cracked the foil Edric in a Conspiracy booster box I purchased when that set first came out. Once I opened the booster and saw that foil Edric, I knew I had to brew with him. If you want to see a financially friendlier version of this deck, stick around until the end in order to see what changes to make in order to build it on a significantly lower budget. Edric, first released in one of the original Commander precons, is a 2/2 elf rogue for 1 generic, 1 blue, and 1 green. He has, whenever a creature deals combat damage to one of your opponents, its controller may draw a card. This is just pure, unadulterated politics. Players get value from attacking themselves, but not you. This ability is so busted that Edric is banned in 1v1 Commander. Although not an original way of building around Edric, my brew focuses on small and cheap creatures that have some form of ultimate evasion in order for me to draw as many cards per turn as possible. Therefore, no creature in this deck will cost over 2 mana, with the exception of Edric. Originally, the deck ran many 1-drops that have land walk or some kind. However, when playing, sometimes opponents didn't have a land of that type in play, and I ended up with 1/1s on the board that would never get through with combat damage to make use of Edric's abilities. Although it would be preferable to only use creatures with straight up unblockable, there are only so many of them in green-blue that cost 2 mana or less. Ideally, the deck wants all its creatures to be like Slitherblade, for example, a 1/1 for 1 mana that is outright unblockable. Therefore, the best creatures in the deck, besides Slitherblade, are Gudul Lurker, Mistcloaked Herald, and Trident Shorestalker. These creatures can be dropped quickly before Edric even hits the board, and can already draw us cards by turn 3. That being said, there are other forms of useful evasion that can help get damage through, such as flying. And, although not guaranteed to be unblockable, flying does work pretty well, all things considering, at least from experience. 1-drops that only have flying and no other abilities, at least within this deck, are Fairy Miscreant, Flying Men, Gale Rider Sliver, Scribe Sprites, and Zephyr Sprite. The rest of the 1-drop flyers serve the same exact purpose as the former, cheap creatures to get draw off of Edric, but come with a bonus ability that could be useful depending on the situation. Artificer's Assistant scries 1 whenever you cast a historic spell, but there are only 8 spells in the deck that will trigger it. Fairy Seer scries 2 when it enters the battlefield. Hope of Girapur can be sacrificed after dealing combat damage to a player in order to prevent that player from playing any non-creature spells during their next turn. Hypnotic Siren can instead be cast for its bestow cost in order to steal a creature from someone. Not only that, but that creature will gain +1/+1 and flying too. Then, when that creature leaves the battlefield, Hypnotic Siren stays in play as its creature form. Jace's Phantasm can become a 5/5 as long as an opponent has 10 or more cards in their graveyard. This being Commander, that's not very unlikely to happen. Mausoleum Wanderer can be sacrificed in order to counter an instant or sorcery spell unless its caster pays an amount of generic mana equal to its power. Terramander has Adapt 4 and, although it costs 8 mana to activate, it costs 1 generic less for each instant and sorcery card in our graveyard, which, as you'll see further on, could be quite a few. Siren Storm Tamer can be sacrificed for 1 blue in order to counter a spell or ability that targets us or a creature we control. Spectral Sailor has Flash and has a mana sink for drawing cards. For just 4 mana, we can draw a card. I'm going to count Signal Pest in this category since it can't be blocked by a creature unless it has flying. So it has a soft form of flying. That being said, it does have Battle Cry, which might not seem like much in Commander, but in a Weenie deck, it can be the difference between winning the game and not winning the game. Besides flying, there are way better keywords for evasion, like Shadow and Horsemanship. My brew runs Thalakos Seer, Thalakos Sentry, Wu Light Cavalry, and Wu Scout. Due to the lack of Shadow and Horsemanship available in the current card pool, it's safe to say that there's a high likelihood that these creatures are practically unblockable for all effects and purposes. As a bonus, Thalakos Seer draws us a card when it leaves the battlefield, and Wu Scout lets us look at target opponent's hand when it enters the battlefield. As for actual unblockable creatures of converted mana cost 2, the deck runs Blighted Agent, Escape Artist, Flitterstep Eidolon, Invisible Stalker, Jessian Infiltrator, Metathran Soldier, and River Sneak. Although not actually unblockable, I will count Tetsuko Umezawa Fugitive in this category since she makes herself unblockable as long as her power or toughness is 1 or less. She also makes all our flyers unblockable just in case our opponents have too many flyers of their own. Although I wanted to limit the CMC of flyers to be 1 and the unblockables to be no greater than a CMC of 2, Cloud of Fairies is the only 2-drop flyer in the deck, and that's because it's technically free to cast since it uptaps 2 lands when it enters the battlefield. This is crazy since this deck runs lands like Nykthos Shrine to Nyx and Gaia's Cradle. With so many cheap creatures, it's worth running. Alluring. Although this enchantment can also help opponents, it helps us more since all 32 creatures in this deck cost less than 3 mana. You can even use it with Edric, although it's worth noting that Alluring cannot bypass commander tags. Now, I know what you're thinking. These creatures are essentially trash if Edric isn't on the battlefield. And you'd be absolutely correct. Which is why the deck shouldn't solely rely on Edric for those sweet card draw triggers off of combat damage. The deck runs Bident of Thassa and Coastal Piracy for redundancy. At least these enchantments don't help out opponents like Edric does. Bident of Thassa also has an ability that lets you tap it to force an opponent to attack with all their creatures. But I've yet to use that ability in this deck. However, card draw shouldn't be the only way to take advantage of attacking with lots of creatures. I'm also running Druid's Repository in order to store up mana with every attacking creature. This enchantment pretty much hands out an insane amount of mana in this deck. With so many cheap spells, you're pretty much guaranteed to cast most of the cards you draw after combat thanks to it. Since this deck loves turning creatures sideways, why not include Beastmaster Ascension as well? With a deck chocked full of weenies, this enchantment goes online fairly easily and seemingly out of nowhere. Now those small fry are huge and can take an opponent out in a single combat step, maybe even the whole table. And speaking of taking out the entire table out of nowhere, Triumph of the Hordes is usually a game-ending spell when cast. 5 unblockable creatures is enough to take an opponent out of the game, and with enough creatures, potentially more players. Another way to secure the win via combat damage is with Biomass Mutation. This instant can make our weenies XX, where X is the amount of generic mana used when casting it. This spell is crazy. With enough mana, you could take out the entire board. You don't even need that much mana either if you have enough creatures. It's not uncommon to play this deck full of extra turn spells, but that's not something I wanted to do when building Edric. That being said, there's only one extra turn spell, and that's Notorious Throng. This spell is just too good not to include. Not only does it have the potential to give us an extra turn for its prowl cost, but it creates an amount of 1/1 flyers equal to the damage dealt to opponents that turn. Its prowl cost is also relatively guaranteed in this deck since Edric is a rogue. And not only Edric, but the deck has 7 other rogues that are unblockable. So instead of running lots of extra turn spells, I simply run lots of counterspells or other spells to help protect my board state. As far as counterspells go, I'm running Mana Drain, Disallow, Dissipate, Fairy Trickery, Forbid, Force of Negation, Force of Will, Swan Song, Pact of Negation, Rewind, Void Shatter, and Void Slime. Mana Drain is a strictly better counterspell. Keep in mind though that it wasn't always that way. Mana Burn used to be a thing back in the day. It counters any spell and also gives us X colorless mana at the beginning of our next main phase, where X is the casting cost of the spell. Now this mana, since it's colorless, doesn't really help us in a deck full of 1-drops. However, if you're to sink it in something like Biomass Mutation, then that mana drain can come in very, very useful. Disallow and Void Slime can not only counter any spell, but can also counter an activated or triggered ability as well. Dissipate and Void Shatter will exile the spell being countered, which is great against decks that can recur things. Fairy Trickery and Force of Negation can also exile the spell they counter, but it's a conditional counterspell. Fairy Trickery can only counter it if it's a non-fairy spell, whereas Force of Negation can only counter it if it's a non-creature spell. At least, Force of Negation can be cast for free at the cost of exiling a blue card from our hand outside of our own turn. And speaking of that alternate cost, Force of Will can counter any spell, although it won't exile it, at the cost of exiling a blue card from our hand and paying 1 life. As for an actual free counterspell, look no further than Pact of Negation. Sure, you have to pay 5 mana during your next upkeep, otherwise you lose the game, but at least you can cast it entirely for free when you need to. Another technically free counterspell, but you still need mana to cast, is Rewind. Rewind does require you to have 4 mana available in order to cast it, but when you do, you get to untap 4 lands. That's the main reason I run it in this deck. Those 4 lands you untap could easily be Gaia's Cradle and or Nykthos Shrine to Nyx. So Rewind can function not only as a counterspell, but mana source also, similar to Mana Drain. Other situational counterspells include Swan Song, which can only counter an instant, sorcery, or enchantment spell. Use this only under dire straits, since it gives the controller of that spell a 2/2 flyer, which can then be used to block our own flyers. Saving the best for last, Forbid is the best counterspell in this deck. Since we're always going to have a handful of cards, it's very easy to pay for Forbid's buyback cost. With simply discarding 2 cards after we cast it, it returns to our hand instead of the graveyard. Although not counterspells in the exact sense of the term, Summary Dismissal and Mindbreak Trap can just exile a spell or all spells from the stack. They bypass the "this spell cannot be countered" clause. So if an opponent casts a Supreme Verdict, expecting your board to just up and die, you can cast Summary Dismissal in response and exile Supreme Verdict. Trust me, nothing feels better than erasing an opponent's smug face when you respond to their uncounterable spell by exiling it altogether. If, for some reason, you don't draw into counterspells with all the card draw, Mystical Tutor and Merchant Scroll can be used to top deck said type of card in order to draw into it afterwards. That way you can have a counter ready just in case. Or just tutor up for a Cyclonic Rift or possibly Triumph of the Hordes. Keep in mind that you do have to reveal the card you tutored for. Besides counterspells, there are other ways of protecting our board as well as disrupting opponents' boards. Simic Charm can give all of our permanents hexproof. It can bounce a creature, whether our own or an opponent's, or it can give a creature +3/+3. It might seem like the best mode is the mass hexproof, but sometimes that +3/+3 can be enough to take out an opponent, especially if used after Triumph of the Hordes. Similarly, Heroic Intervention gives all of our permanents hexproof as well as indestructible. Another way to protect our creatures from wraths as well as max exile, mass bounce, mass negative counters, etc. is with Teferi's Veil. When our creatures are phased out, it's as if they cease to exist. So if an opponent casts anything during their turn, such as the run-of-the-mill sorcery speed Wrath, our creatures are phased out so they won't get destroyed or affected. Then at the beginning of our untap step, they phase back in. This doesn't give them summoning sickness, which means we can continue to attack with them. Other ways of disrupting our opponents or making sure our creatures connect is with Back to Nature. This destroys all enchantments in play, which is used when facing that Pillow Fort player. We don't want to pay so much mana just to send a single or a couple of 1/1s their way. Cyclonic Rift is also good for getting rid of annoying non-lands in play, but then again, Cyclonic Rift is just plain good. The salt factor is high with this one. Constant Miss is also a great disruption card. Maybe we're facing against another Stompy deck, but our Weenies aren't enough protection. Besides, we don't want them for defense, we want them to attack and draw us cards. Since all our cards are so cheap, we have the luxury of sacrificing a land to pay for the buyback cost of Constant Miss. That way we can always receive 0 damage from a player sending a huge swarm or horde our way. While on the topic of sacrificing lands, we might be discarding a bunch of them during our cleanup step. Casting Splendid Reclamation with a bunch of lands in our graveyard provides some epic ramp. This will get us a bunch of lands available for keeping mana open for counterspells, as well as lands to sacrifice for Constant Miss. Also, this can return fetch lands so we can continue thinning the deck of lands. Also, Elixir of Immortality is great at shuffling our graveyard into our library in case we run the risk of decking ourselves. We can use this to also fill our deck back with counterspells or any creatures lost along the way. Oh, and we gain 5 life too. One thing to note is that we want to keep our mana available for defensive and reactive plays. But what if we didn't cast any of those spells? Have we just wasted our resources and fallen behind by not casting anything in our main phase? Not really. Alchemist's Refuge and Winding Canyons allows us to cast things at instant speed for just 2 mana. meaning that we can cast those spells at the end of the turn before ours with all the open mana that we didn't use for counterspells. The rest of the cards are lands and mana rocks. The deck only runs 33 lands, but that's because the average CMC is so low. Also, the 2 rocks included in the deck are free, Mox Diamond and Chrome Mox. The deck runs all 8 fetch lands, which also serve to thin the deck of lands since we don't want to draw into a bunch of them, especially in a deck where we draw into so many cards. For mana fixing the deck, we run Botanical Sanctum, Hinterland Harbor, Flooded Grove, Reflecting Pool, Command Tower, City of Brass, Mana Confluence, Waterlogged Grove, Yavimaya Coast, Breeding Pool, and Tropical Island. The rest of the lands are just 5 basic forests and 5 basic islands. I know that Edric isn't an uncommon commander, but this is how I play it. This is my take on the unblockable Weenie's version of an Edric deck. This deck is very powerful, but can also be built relatively on a budget. If you follow the changes in the following table, you can significantly decrease the overall cost of this deck from around $1,796 to about $83. Again, the reason that this particular version of the deck is so expensive is just because it has Mox Diamond, Tropical Island, Gaia's Cradle, and Mana Drain. But if you bypass those cards, then it would be significantly cheaper. Even then, this deck could still be built for even half of that if you remove all of the $3 to $4 cards. So realistically speaking, you could have a spicy Edric deck for about $40. So even on a budget, this deck is so strong that you can easily make an impact in a budget pot. Keep in mind though that your politics game needs to be strong in order to be a spectator in the match instead of the arch enemy. This deck is a lot of fun to play, and I hope I have inspired some of you with this spicy brew. I want to take this opportunity to thank all my higher tier patrons, the brewers, for their patronage. And to everyone here, thanks for watching this episode of The Brewery on the Commander Tavern. I am Demented Kirby, and happy brewing.